Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this week's installment of the Thirsty for Knowledge Free Business Law web series. Before our presentation, I just want to mention a few items before we begin. This meeting is being recorded and a final version will be provided via email to all registrants. The recording will also be published on the Cibolo Economic Development YouTube channel and all other social media platforms. We are quickly coming on the final dates of the series, so be sure to register for the remaining sessions. Just to note, the chat feature is also enabled, so please feel free to share any questions or comments for our presenters. Those through Eventbrite, you were provided with both of our presenters' emails in case you have any questions. But with those items out of the way, I would like to introduce our wonderful speakers for today's presentation. Kristen Hetzel, the HR manager for the City of Cibolo, and attorney Adelita Cavada with Adelita Cavada Law. Please feel free to take it away.
Yes, my name is Adelita Cavada, and just a quick disclaimer, even though I am an attorney and even though I'm participating here with these presentations, it should not be considered attorney-client privilege between me and any of the participants or any of the listeners, nor is it legal advice. If you have any legal advice, please, or you need any legal advice, please feel free to email me directly or contact an attorney with any questions.
Thank you so much. We always value your wonderful information. How's that, Adelita? And thank you for that introduction, Dustin. We are here today and we are going to talk about employee discipline, why policies and procedures are our friends. So why do we need an employee discipline policy? What is an employee discipline policy? And what should I be putting in it? That's the kind of things we are going to talk about today. And so let's start with a simple discipline policy. This is Business News Daily's definition, where they say the policy is going to identify and standardize procedures for responding to incidences that go against company policy. And a well-written policy is going to clearly state your company's rules and the consequences of what happens when those rules are broken. So they identified three things in here. What are your policies? What incidences are going to, what rules are going to be broken, what they're going to do if something happens, and what the consequences are. So do you just get fired on the spot? Do you get a demotion? Do you get demerit? So those are three of the basic tenets for a disciplinary policy. But in my personal opinion, policy should include a lot more. So let's make sure that, number one, if for some reason you are in a specialized service or you have additional rules or laws that apply to you or your workforce, we need to make sure that those laws are identified in your policy so we can note what they are and note that we need to follow them. You may not need to detail all the events that are involved in them, but we need to note that they exist. So if somebody were looking at it, an employee maybe, then they would know that you are also following other policies or other laws or statutes. So in my example, the city, we have fire and police officers. They have a government code which talks about their different types of discipline that we can and what we have to do if somebody makes a complaint against them. There are also, for other public entities, they may have civil service rules or local government codes or something that defines their policies and their disciplinary abilities.
So before you move on to the next bullet, I did want to make a point, right? So police and fire and civil service, government types of jobs, there are laws that cover them, right? But there's laws that cover you too as a private company. Don't assume that there aren't laws out there that won't apply to you. We've talked in previous presentations about, you know, the permits and taxes and those kinds of rules, but don't think that the government stops there in imposing rules on the workforce, right? So make sure that you're covered and that you understand which laws do or do not apply to you or your organization. And always keep in mind that the law, right, whatever law there is out there, city, county, state, and federal, that is always the minimum, right? That is the absolute minimum rules or regulations or whatever you have to have in your workforce or when you're developing your policies. Those are the base, those are the minimum. It does not mean that you cannot add more.
That's a good point. So what happens, number 2, under the policies section that we should include is what is an investigation and what happens during an investigation. So think about the process. So somebody is going to make a complaint, and this somebody may be a supervisor. So my employee didn't follow, they were insubordinate, or this could be a peer or a fellow employee. They could be complaining about sexual harassment or some form of investigation. And the type of investigation and the length of the investigation is obviously going to vary depending on the complaint and the severity of the complaint. But what happens in that investigation? We need to identify that in our policy. I recommend always noting that you're going to take every complaint seriously and that you're going to investigate as soon as practical. I try not to put hard language about dates, because if there's a holiday, if somebody's on vacation, if you can't reach the accused or the complainant, then your dates may have to change. And so we just want to leave a little wiggle room for us. And so say something like, we are going to investigate as soon as practical.
Yeah, and that's a very good point, right? If you put in your policies and in your rules, right, that investigations will start within 24 hours of a complaint, of a complaint being lodged, right? You're really hamstringing yourself and you're hamstringing your company, because 24 hours is not always going to be practical. What if the person you have in charge, at your organization for this kind of stuff is on vacation, right? Or they're on sick leave, or they had to leave the office, right? There's a whole lot that can go wrong when you start imposing, strict rules and saying things on yourself that says 24 hours, right? But if you say as soon as practical, right, it's giving yourself a little bit of leeway. And it gives your employees a good idea that an investigation will start shortly.
Yes, what I feel like employees are known for is they're going to come back on Friday and make the complaint at 4 o'clock on Friday. They've been stressing about it all week if it's something serious, and they finally break down and say, yep, I'm going to do it. And then they're going to walk out of the door. And so now if you have a 24-hour policy, you're trying to work overtime on the weekend, then you got to pay your people that you're interviewing overtime, and you're trying to get a hold of them on the weekend when they're at home with their family, and you've really just cornered yourself. And we don't want to do that.
Yeah.
We want to make it easy for us, but we want to show good faith to the employee, and should it ever, the investigation or the discipline ever have to go to arbitration or anything, we want to make sure that we followed our policy.
Yeah.
Also in the investigation, we want to list what to do with interviews and evidence. So if you find something that substantiates or does not substantiate the claim, is there any form of evidence? Did you have video? Do you have time clock data? Do you have an audit on the computer system? Any of the evidence, and then any of the interviews. Interviews are a fun and tricky thing. Everybody has a different policy on how to proceed with them. And again, this is just my personal policy. I like to talk to the complainant first, so the person who's making the complaint, and then go through all the witnesses that they have provided or that you have discovered through the conversations. And then I like to talk to the accused last. When you talk to somebody like law enforcement officers, they're going to do it completely opposite. They want to hear from the accused first so they can get their story settled, and then go ask everybody the follow-up questions. I feel like I would rather know what I'm asking so I can drill down, because if you've ever talked to somebody, if you say, did you do something wrong or did you do something bad, their answer is going to be no. They didn't feel like it was their fault at the time, or they didn't actually remember that incident. And so if you give them a specific, did you talk to Sue Ellen in the break room on Thursday? Well, sure I did. Y'all were talking about, were you talking about lunch and ham sandwiches? Well, yes. Then you can walk them in and you've helped remind them a little bit. Totally different when it comes to a legal aspects. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and you bring up a really good point, right? your workplace investigation is not a criminal investigation. You're not a police officer. You're not a district attorney trying to get to the bottom of the crime, right? Your goal at the end of all this is to have a workforce that is on task, and to get rid of those kinds of distractions, whatever it may be. It could be, verbal abuse, or it could be some sexual harassment, or it could be, an employee stealing, or a person who's there who just causes conflict, right? They're causing a lot of problems. They're not crimes, they're not really, doing much other than creating this problem in the workforce that affects the profitability of your business and the motivation of your other employees, right? So this is not, your job is not to act like a police officer. Your job is to act like the employer trying to investigate a complaint, right, against an employee, right? And because your motivation is a little bit different, right? We don't need to be interrogating people. We should be interviewing, right? And we should be gathering documents or proof to substantiate any of the complaints, right? But this isn't criminal, right? So, cool it and keep that in mind while you do these things. That your goal is really to get everyone back to work.
Absolutely. Part of the investigation that we do need to talk about is what types of incidents are getting investigated and what happens if you're going to stray from your normal investigation, right? So we've told them we are going to investigate as soon as practical, but there are certain times where we're not going to do that. One of those, of course, is going to be criminal charges. Sorry about that. If you are talking to somebody and something comes up and it sounds like a criminal charge, you wrap that conversation up, and we are going to then contact law enforcement. So Adelita and I have this great example of a sexual harassment claim.
I was hoping you'd talk about that one because that one's good.
Of course I would. And during this, it seemed like a pretty standard harassment claim. One employee is complaining that another employee likes them and is hitting on them and is making them very uncomfortable at work. And so the investigation is going pretty standard. And then the guy throws this curveball and he says, I have proof that this person likes me. I have videotaped them in the bathroom.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it is illegal to videotape people in restrooms and dressing rooms, if you didn't know. And so we said, okay, great. Send me a copy of that. I'd love to be able to add that to your case. And he said, great. And he sent it over. And I made a phone call to a non-emergency officer and said, hey, guess what I got for you? A criminal case.
Yeah.
So that stopped our investigation right there. That sound about right, Adelita?
Yeah, and it stopped our investigation because we are not police officers and we are not equipped to conduct a criminal investigation, right? We heard something that was disturbing enough, and we knew right away, that this sounds more like a crime than a harassment complaint, right? We've kind of jumped ship here. Kristen notified the appropriate law enforcement agency right away, right? And our investigation and our interview stopped, right? And we let the professionals handle it. As a business owner or with your employees, you're not a cop either. And it is not your responsibility to conduct any more of an investigation for the police. And if you do, you're going to muck things up, right? You're going to cause more problems than you originally had, right? If you try to handle it yourself. So if it gets into a criminal kind of area, let those professionals handle it. Don't be handling that yourself.
Wonderful. And the other time that we may not want to investigate is something that I like to call gross misconduct. So if you are standing there and somebody starts punching people, that's not the time to sit down and to start an investigation. That's not even the time to write them up with a formal document that says you're going to be disciplined. That's the time to send them home and then to work on your end on the back end. So that's when we would write them up and say, okay, this is the next day, you can come in and we've got some paperwork for you, or follow up with that. that's not the time to start your investigation. So we want to make sure that we have some generic language in the system that shows that there are times when we are not going to investigate. And that would also fall under the as soon as practical. It's not practical to investigate immediately in the middle of gross misconduct.
Right.
But what are you going to discipline for? And that needs to be listed in your disciplinary policy. You need to list, and you cannot list all of the items. Don't feel like you have to list all the items, and if it's not listed, it won't be covered. That is not the case. But we do need to identify some basic prohibited items. Violence is prohibited, right? We're not going to allow that. We're not going to allow discrimination. We also need to think about what issues does your office have? Does your workforce have a gossip issue? Okay, then let's add something about gossip in there. No gossiping, no spreading false or misinformation or something that is impacting your ability to work with your customers, clients, or fellow coworkers. That can be something that we can add in there. What goes against your organization's culture and integrity? Does your culture have some values and some value statements that they follow? You can identify items that go against that. I think it's the Aggies. We don't lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate those who do. I feel like that's an Aggie thing. Don't quote me on that one though. And so that may be something that your organization doesn't tolerate, and so maybe you have specific disciplinary items listed there that you want to be able to discipline for.
And when it comes to culture, be careful, right? If you allow, let's say, cursing in the workforce, right? F-bombs and S-bombs and B-bombs are bandied about in a joking manner, and people just use them, right? And that's something we allow. And then somebody gets into, some employees get into a fight and they start throwing F-bombs and S-bombs and B-bombs at each other. Well, you've allowed it, right? So disciplining for cursing, when you allow it, as a joke, those are problems. And those are some things you might want to consider when you're, shaping the culture of your business or your company right at the outset. And then keep it in mind when you're developing these policies and procedures, right? When it comes to things like that, it sounds like something little, right? But if you have two employees yelling at each other and, calling each other names and using curse words, and then as part of the discipline, process, you say, look, you called them this, you called them that. We can't have you using those words in the workplace. Their first response is going to be, wait a minute, you let so-and-so say it. And then now you're on the defense. Well, that was just a joke, right? No, either you allow it or you don't. So if you allow cursing and that kind of behavior in your workforce, you can't discipline for it later, right? Then you're kind of picking on people. And that can lead to bigger problems, right? But you can discipline for fighting or, the disturbing the workforce or whatever it is. You just can't say, well, you were cursing, right? So I wanted to point that out.
Good point. Good point. Once we do identify those incidences that we're going to investigate and potentially just discipline on, is we want to talk about what are the consequences or types of disciplines, and then appeals. We always want to add an appeal. Standard types of discipline include what's called progressive discipline. And so progressive discipline means, for the most part, you are going to start with the top one, verbal, and work your way through. So verbal counseling, so that is making sure you're just talking to somebody, hey, this wasn't good behavior, you came in late today, let's work on our tardiness, let's make sure we're at least 5 minutes early every day. If that doesn't fix the problem, if our counseling hasn't fixed it, then maybe we move on to written discipline, so that is the write-up. You were tardy on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Tardiness is not tolerated. We have a policy against it. So that here's a copy of your written write-up, and it's going in your personnel file. They still don't correct the behavior. Maybe you suspend them. You've been showing up 15 to 30 minutes late for the last 2 weeks. Is something going on? No. Okay. We're trying to correct you. We told you it didn't correct the behavior. We wrote you up so you recognize how serious it is. It's still not correcting the behavior. So I'm going to send you home for the rest of the day without pay. I'm going to suspend you, and there will be no pay involved in that. That should get their attention. They come back, they still don't do it. Of course, you have the option to demote them. So if they are a senior so-and-so, maybe you move them to a junior, you hit their paycheck permanently if it's serious enough. And of course, the final one would be termination. And do keep in mind that just because you have progressive discipline, if that's what you choose to use as progressive, does not mean that you have to follow all 5 steps all the time. So if you have somebody who throws a punch, you do not say, that's not good, don't do it again, and give them a verbal warning. And then wait for them to throw another punch to somebody else and then give them a written warning. That is not how progressive discipline works. Progressive discipline in your policy should have a statement that says you evaluate the incident, you evaluate the problem, you have a factor that's gonna tell you whether or not you start with verbal or you start with written. So factors that you may consider is the seriousness of the employee's offense. So throwing punches is pretty serious. It's not something we expect at work. The position the person holds. So if it's a supervisor, we have higher expectations on our supervisor. They should know better, right? So if your supervisor and your frontline staff both go and they are, doing some joke on somebody, and then maybe you want to discipline the supervisor one step ahead of the frontline staff. You want to make an example. They need to understand, and that it's way worse coming from a supervisor than it is from an entry-level person. And of course, you always want to look at their employment history. Have they done this before? Do they do this every year? Do they try to get away with one thing? And finally, the similar actions. Has this happened in your workplace before? So has somebody else punched somebody? If they punch somebody, did they get sent home once? Did they get terminated? How did y'all respond to that? Just because you've responded one way in the past does not mean that is forever set your precedence. It has set one, but you do not have to stick to it. You can say, as of this date, we've changed our culture. We're not tolerating that anymore. Or we made an error in that last time, and so from now on, we're going to change it. That does not mean you have free will to be able to change your culture or change your level every single time for every single person. That will get you in trouble.
So, and what I would like to add to that is remedial measures cannot be used against you in court generally, right? So you have a policy or you screw up big time, right? And now your company is being sued, but you've gone back and you've fixed whatever issue that is, right? Where, I don't know, you terminated the offending employee, right? Or you've done something to fix the problem that caused you to get sued in the first place. That can't be used against you generally, right? In court, right? They knew that it was wrong, right? Because they fixed it after it happened. It doesn't work like that. So don't think that you can't go back and fix things after they've already, gone asunder, right? And gotten you in trouble. You absolutely can, and you should, right? Because at the end of the day, it's about keeping your business intact and keeping your business profitable. I would like to say, when it comes to the verbal discipline, right? Yes, it is a verbal discipline, which means you spoke discipline to the employee, right? You were 5 minutes late, you're consistently 5 minutes late or 20 minutes late or 15 minutes late. This is your warning. I need you to be on time, right? Now, even though it's verbal, you do have to document it, right? So verbal is actually kind of a written one too, right? It kind of bumps into the next one. But it's very important that after you give a verbal discipline, that you follow up with some sort of, you follow up with it. You send an email, hey, as we discussed, right? You need to address this behavior, right? So that you can go on to the next one. When you're writing your policy book and you're saying, and you're getting to the discipline part, right? I would suggest that you don't say such finite things like, this company has a progressive discipline, policy, right? Say this, when you say it that way, right? When you make it absolute like that, then you're setting yourself up that that's how you have to do it all the time. And you might have someone who could come back and argue, maybe a clever attorney that says you didn't follow your progressive discipline, right? So you have to say we generally follow, but like Kristen mentioned, it depends on the offense. It depends on the offense, and it depends on your position, right? If you have, let's say, two entry-level employees, arguing over, who took their lunch from, the lunchroom, right? That's low. That's maybe a verbal, that's maybe a written, right, kind of reprimand for them. But if you have a manager or someone in authority come in and say, that low-level employee took my lunch from the lunchroom, you have kind of a bigger problem here. And a harsher, you can start off with a harsher discipline for that management level, right? Because that's not behavior that you need in a manager. It causes discord, it causes distractions from work, right? When you have a manager behaving that way, right? So those are some things to keep in mind.
One of the ways I keep verbal and written separated is I feel like verbal is way more one-sided. It's going to come from the employer to the employee. We're going to have that conversation, and then I'm going to document it in an email that says, per our conversation earlier, A, B, and C. So they don't really get a full chance to respond back. I don't care if they sign on or agree, honestly. Short of them coming back and saying there's a massive discrepancy. They don't have to sign off. That's not two keys. When it comes to written, I do want them to sign off. I want them to sign off that they have received it, that they recognize that I've identified what the next steps are. And again, we're using language that may include, not shall. You don't want to, again, box yourself into that corner. And so for me, written involves a little more two-way, because I'm going to sign the written document and I'm going to have them sign the document. And if they refuse to sign the document, then my witness is going to document that they refuse to sign the document.
Yeah.
And so that way I still have two people. That's kind of how I separate the written and verbal. I also all strongly recommend an appeal. The appeal does not have to be formalized in a large setting. So you don't have to create a whole new document that says the employee is allowed to appeal these decisions, and they have to do this within 2 days, and then we do this within 2 days. Don't box yourself again into a corner. I recommend only allowing an appeal on the bottom three if you're using a suspension, demotion, or termination. So that's the ones that are impacting the employee's paycheck. So that notes a difference, makes it a little more important. And then I would just say, and it's going to appeal to, and either your head of HR if they're not involved in investigations, or the head of the company if they're not involved in the investigations. We need to have that separation of power, so it is a true appeal. And then just say, and that person has the right to overturn the discipline or modify the discipline or do nothing. So that person may look at what's presented by the appealed employee. So the appealed employee is probably going to write a letter. So probably say they need to provide a written appeal to the CEO within 5 business days after the original notification of discipline was received.
Absolutely.
And then they have those 5 days, you have that letter. And then when the CEO or whoever receives that, the person who provided the discipline is going to provide their documentations. And then the CEO is going to decide, do I want to listen to this employee? Does this look like there's more side of the story to it? Even if they say no, and they have a history of saying, no, I looked at it, I'm upholding it, we're moving on. It still is really considered good for the employer to do that. EEOC loves that. There was an internal process, there's an internal review, there was an appeal process. So we add that even if we don't have to use it a lot. that make sense, Adelita?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So that's why we love appeal process, the appeal process. Sounds like an extra step, and sometimes it feels a little burdensome, but it it is a goodwill gesture on the point of the employer, and it is well received from the other entities.
Yeah. It's well received by everyone. Yeah.
Oh yeah, and employees, happy employees. Okay, so here's your big what ifs. What if we don't have a policy? Make one, buy one, steal one from the internet. This is the age of the internet. We don't have excuses for not having policies.
Absolutely.
Fully read it if you are stealing a policy. Let's make sure we are not taking something that still has another company's name in it or has non-relevant parts to our organization. But you need a policy. You can make that today. You can take one this weekend and have a policy by Monday. Just pick one at a time, baby steps. So you don't have any policies, great, pick one and start with it. 2, their supervisor. Shouldn't they know better? Absolutely, they should know better. So correct them differently, discipline them, move it up a step. So if you're just giving a verbal to somebody else, then give a written to your supervisor because you have higher expectations. But that is also a big red light. Did the supervisor truly know better? Do you need to retrain your supervisors? Was it something that they could be trained on? So use all of these as opportunities to evaluate and improve your workforce. These are little minor warnings before something goes seriously wrong. Okay, I don't want to follow the rules. We don't have policies because we don't need policies. We just do the right thing.
Yeah, we're all adults here. You know, we all know we're all adults. I hear that phrase a lot, and it's at your own risk, right? What is common sense to you is not common sense to everybody else, right?
You should
So
know that by driving on highways.
yeah, no, no, right? That doesn't work that way. Every state has different, driving rules, different signs, right? So don't think that don't think that people come in with the exact same, background and access to information that you had, right? That makes sense to you. It doesn't quite work that way, right? And then, when it comes to supervisors, right? And I'm not sure if we hit it on it in another presentation. I think we did, but promoting someone because they're good at their job is not a good reason to promote someone, right? Supervisors, they're not doing the same job as whatever they were doing before they were promoted. Now they are supervisors. So when you're looking for supervisors, it needs to be people who have demonstrated to you leadership abilities and the ability to motivate employees to do their jobs, right? Because the supervisor's job is not something else, right? If you've done that, if you've just promoted people who are just good at their job because they're good at their job, right? They're not going to know better. And so make sure that you go back and have those policies, right? Find one, hire someone to write them yourself, steal them off the internet, call Kristen, call me, right? Do something, right? Because supervisors should know better, but who did you promote, right? They don't magically know things because you promoted them because they knew their job, right? And now they magically know all the rules and how to be a good supervisor, right? So that's something to keep in mind, right? It's something to keep in mind when you're promoting people or hiring supervisors, right? Make sure that they're leaders, not just good at their job.
Don't make them a supervisor if you really mean to make them a senior lead worker. There's a difference.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a whole different conversation. Okay, so what are our best practices? Have a written policy. You cannot say you have not heard us say that multiple times today. Have a written policy for discipline. It is going to help you. It is going to help you train your supervisors. It is going to help give expectations to your employees. What I did not touch on is be the hot stove. So what does that mean to be the hot stove? So think about, and again, I'm a little older, think about ye olden days, those hot stoves with the coil, not our nice glass top ones. What happens if we touch that hot stove? We receive immediate feedback. I touch the stove, whew, it's hot, burns my fingers, take my hands off. right?
Yes,
So the same
absolutely.
thing with discipline. Don't wait 2 weeks or 3 weeks or wait for them to do it 5 times before we're going to tell them that's not acceptable behavior. We're going to tell them immediately as soon as we find out, as soon as we can get our ducks in a row, we're going to go have that conversation with them verbally or written. The hot stove also did its best to warn me. It's glowing red, right? I should have known better. So your policies are going to be your should have known better glowing red. They know that if they're going to come in more than 15 minutes early and sit down and drink coffee for 45 minutes and sit there and gossip, that they're going to get in trouble and get written up. You should have that warning in the case, your policy. The hot stove is also consistent. So if I do it once and go, whew, that burned, and I stop and I walk around the kitchen for a minute and I come back and I touch it again, I'm still getting burned. So every time I am getting disciplined for doing the same bad behavior.
I love that. And it's going to burn no matter who touches it.
So it's
If
number 4 is it's impersonal, right?
right.
So if I touch the hot stove, I get burned. If Adelita touches the hot stove, she gets burned. If Dustin learns nothing from us, rolls up and touches the hot stove, he also gets burned. So that hot stove has four things in that analogy. It's immediate, it's providing a warning, it's consistent, and it's impersonal. So that's what I mean when I say be the hot stove when it comes to your disciplinary practices.
Absolutely. Yeah. I love that analogy. I'm going to use that.
I'm awesome. Don't confuse behavioral adjustments such as coaching with discipline. So some of you may have heard of a phrase called a PIP, or a performance improvement plan. So a PIP is something we do when we want to clearly identify behavior that we want changed with an employee, what we expect for them to change, how we expect it to be, and when we need the change. It's kind of like a SMART goal, SMART goal for bad behavior. What I mean here when I say don't confuse behavioral adjustments with discipline is do not give somebody a PIP and then 90 days later fire them every single time. That means your PIP is just a warning for them to go find a new job. It is not a behavioral adjustment. We honestly want to take these employees and just correct the behavior and then still retain them as employees. I always say worst case scenario, I'm lazy, and let's assume I'm not trying to fire everybody because then I have to process a termination and unemployment, close down all their insurance, repost the job, restart with a new person, pay for all of the new person stuff. Worst case scenario, I'm lazy and I want to keep all my employees, but I want them to be good employees. So I want to coach and behaviorally adjust them if they're doing something that's not desirable. So you're coming in late. Here's your PIP that says, we do not accept your tardiness. You're considered tardy if you're a minute past your scheduled start time. I need this behavior to correct immediately. And the behavior will be corrected by being here by 8 a.m. every day. Something like that. But if I'm just going to give that to somebody and then always 90 days later, I'm just going to fire them, that is not a CYA. That is not saying I fixed it. So discipline is not the same as behavioral adjustment.
And keep that in mind too. If you've given someone a plan on how to improve their behavior, and you just fire them later, you're setting yourself up for an argument that this whole working on their behavior thing, offering a performance improvement plan was really just a ruse to get rid of someone that you didn't want anymore, right? So if you're, and it could be just, behavior, they're just not doing their job quite right. That would be something, performance improvement plan, right? Like, we've given you plenty of warnings. This is how we need you to do your job. This is how we need these reports done. This is how we need you to talk to customers, right? Whatever it is, right? That's not quite discipline, right? But it'll get there. So you be clear, right? That it's how to improve their performance as opposed to actual discipline for never improving their performance, right? A performance improvement plan could be something you offer for them to show you, the employer, that they can get better without getting disciplined, right? Then later, should you have to demote or should you have to terminate or, somehow, yeah, reassign this employee, you have these performance improvement plans as evidence to show that they couldn't improve their performance, right? It's a fine line distinction, and I know it might be a little bit, that might be something that you might need to ask more on, right? How to the difference between the two, right? And how you could use like failed performance improvement plans as discipline later, but it's important that you realize that they are different, right? And if you have questions, ask.
Wonderful. Okay, so that's the end of this presentation. Just the beginning of your happy, disciplined workforce. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. Double check. Nope. Okay. And thank you so much for your time this morning, and thank you for listening. Thank you so much, Adelita, for coming in and helping with our presentation. Is there anything else you want to add?
No, this was awesome.
This was fun. And thank you for coming in. We do have one more presentation next week, and that will be the end of our summer series. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.